Okay. Welcome, colleagues. My name is Tariq Masood. I am the faculty director of the Middle East Initiative at the Kennedy School and the Ford Foundation Professor of Democracy and Governance here. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's event. When Napoleon was in his exile on the Isle of St. Helena, one of his English jailers asked him, why was it that he invaded Egypt? This was at the end of the 18th century, a very dramatic century. One of the most dramatic acts was Napoleon's expedition to Egypt. And his British jailer was like, I never understood why you did that. And Napoleon looked at him and said, because Egypt is the most important country in the world. And if Egypt is the most important country in the world, then this book, Lumbering State, Restless Society, Egypt in the Modern Era, is the most important book in the world, at least at the moment. And I'm really thrilled to have two of its authors, Professor Nathan Brown of George Washington University and Professor Amr Adly of the American University in Cairo, here to talk to us about it. Egypt would be the most important country in the world, even if Napoleon hadn't said so, or at a minimum, the most important country in the Arab world. It's a country of 110 million people. 1 out of every 4 Arabs is an Egyptian. It is the place where many of the intellectual trends in the Middle East got their start. And it's important to us because it's one of the most arresting and indeed, I might say, heartbreaking cases of the Arab Spring. It's in Egypt, really, that the Arab Spring, which had started in Tunisia, captured the world's attention when, after 18 days of protest, Egypt's longstanding dictator was forced to resign. But it's also in Egypt that that season of promise came a cropper at the hands of a military that removed a democratically elected president and inaugurated a season of repression from which the country has yet to exit. And so there's a lot that we can learn from Egypt about democracy, authoritarianism, and how you move from the one unenviable state to the enviable one. I'll let you decide which of those two is the enviable state. So I'm thrilled to have Professor Brown and Professor Adly. These are two people from whom I learn a great deal, I would say collectively, and I'm a scholar of Egypt, but what they have forgotten about Egypt, I probably haven't learned yet. And so I'm really thrilled for them to be here to talk about their book. They'll speak for about 30 to 40 minutes about the main themes of the book. And then I will, as is my wont, engage them in a little bit of back and forth, maybe ask some impertinent questions, and then we'll open it up to you, our audience, to engage with these two gifted minds. So with that, I will again thank Professor Brown and Professor Adly, and the floor is yours, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Let me begin. That's an incredibly kind introduction, kind not only to Egypt, but to the 3 co-authors, one of whom, unfortunately, Shimaa Hatab, is not able to join us today. But what I'm going to do is focus a little bit kind of on process of writing the book, then get it a little bit into themes, because writing this book was actually kind of fun. Not all the time, right? I mean, usually for most people, writing is like kind of going to the dentist, and it's something you kind of have to do and something that you like to have behind you. But this was kind of exploring with colleagues, having kind of an endless series of discussions, actually not quite endless, because the book in the end was actually produced, but the idea was to try and kind of gather a lot of what had been known about Egypt or being discovered from various different angles and try to pull it together. So in one sense, it's a derivative book, but we're trying to be innovative. Amr is especially innovative in the field of political economy, so I will let him reveal some of his innovations. But let me talk a little bit about kind of the derivative parts, and then a little bit of the where we try to push things a little bit new directions in the analysis. The derivative part would go something like this. I mean, I wouldn't go back to Napoleon and the late 18th and the early 19th century, but I would go back to the 20th century, which is as far back as I can recall. And this was about 25 years or so ago. There was some kind of seminar in Washington I was invited to where they got like some top Egypt academics to talk about the issue of succession. What happens when Mubarak leaves the presidency? And sure enough, they were prescient. Eventually he did, much later and in different circumstances than they thought. And what really struck me was it was a fine question, and we didn't have a clue. We didn't even know how to start talking about this. If you'd asked us what questions we could answer, how we could talk about Egypt, we would start talking in terms of import substitution, industrialization, and corporatism, and civil society. And so we could kind of do those sorts of things. But we didn't actually know an awful lot about Egyptian politics. We knew we had some great conceptual tools for analyzing it, but we weren't necessarily well informed. If you went to Egypt, when I first went to Egypt in 1983, actually, people didn't talk about politics very much, and that began to change. There was actually lively political discussion that kind of grew in the country in 1980s, 1990s, and after that. But it was again sort of about current events. The question of succession was something people would talk about, but there seemed to be kind of a disconnect between the Egypt that Western academics looked at and the Egypt that Egyptians spoke about. And that's been chipped away, and that's what we were trying to take advantage of. And in a sense, that's what is in a sense derivative about the book. So what happened that made it possible to write a book like this? There were institutional developments. I mean, Egypt now has strong political science departments. I think AUC has got world-class scholars. There's the Faculty of Economic Political Science at Cairo University. And a lot of them these are people who are international in the way that they conceive of the discipline of political science. If they write about Egypt, they're still trying to. If they're publishing, they're very often publishing in an international language. The main one of which is English. We Americans are lucky there. So institutionally, there's a change. Also intellectually, I think some of that political discussion in Egypt began to produce some concepts that took that political scientists sort of trained in the discipline could kind of get interested in. So the idea of the rentier state, or actually the idea of the social contract, and even a lot of the interest in possibilities for democratization, I began to hear about these more from Egyptian intellectuals, and there began to be sort of a convergence of sorts of themes that they would talk about that cross borders. And then personally, there were just much richer ties, and I mean that has to do with ease of access for a while. Participation in international conferences, internet, and so on. I used to be in the 1980s. There was one newsstand in Washington where I could pick up one Egyptian newspaper, and it was expensive, so I would do it like once a month, and there wouldn't be much news. And so obviously there's these kind of opening channels. So what we're trying to do in this book, in this sense, is draw on that and say, okay, Egypt is a country of interest to political scientists, and there are some things that political science as a discipline has to say that would be of interest to people who are following Egypt. So in that sense, we're trying to draw it together. And we have kind of an overarching story to tell. It's not a surprising story to anybody who knows Egypt, but it's essentially, and it's suggested in the title, Lumbering State. So you have a history of state building in Egypt that you can observe from many different angles, from the way in which the regimes are structured, from the way in which interest groups are organized and patrolled and licensed and so on. It's certainly in the economy and so on. And so you have this sort of process of state building that you can trace back to the era after Napoleon, the Ottoman era, what we refer to as the Khedival state of the 19th century, but that by the mid-20th century was just a huge presence in all aspects of Egyptian social, political, and economic life, and that began to retreat a little bit. And again, this is a story that's known, but sometimes we'll use a broad term like neoliberalism to describe what happened. And when you unpack the details, there are a lot of details that don't necessarily fit into sort of an easy story of neoliberalism or new liberal society or democratization or that sort of thing. And so we begin to unpack that in politics, society, and economy. I will leave the economy part to Amr because he has some very interesting things to say on that. Let me just say one aspect of the political analysis that I think is a little bit goes beyond simply repeating what we've heard, and is based on some of our own framework. Obviously, all three authors, brought in their own research. If I have a strong suit, it might be because of more political institutional analysis. I'm in political economy, Shimaa and social movement. So there were relative contributions in those areas. But so let me focus on the institutional level. I think what we do here, or what we try to do, we succeeded at least enough to earn a strong compliment from Tariq Masood, which I think we should have probably ended the entire session right there with your endorsement, for fear that holes will emerge. But one thing that we try to do is look not simply at state-society relations, which is standard, but state-regime relations, right? So political scientists all know the difference between regime and state, and this is partly me speaking, but then we forget about it when we start using it, and we will talk about Nasserist Egypt. And what are we talking about? Are we talking about Nasser? Are we talking about the Nasserist regime? Are we talking about the entire state apparatus? We slide among these things in terms of explaining outcomes, structures, even intentions, and so on. And so we really try to unpack this a little bit and tell the story of Egyptian politics, not simply in terms of really big concepts like authoritarianism and democracy and democratization and so on. Those certainly do occur, but also a little bit in terms of how it is that the regime, basically referring sort of to the top levels of the political system, try and use and structure these state apparatus, sometimes fail, sometimes create unintended consequences, ways in which different kinds of social institutions or political institutions in Egypt can operate in ways that are sometimes a little bit difficult to manage. So it is an image of the Egyptian state that is certainly powerful, that even when it retreats is a strong presence in every single area, certainly in social life. It may jettison some of the socialist commitments, but it's still there when you try to organize. Certainly in political life, yes, there is a retreat from the single party system of the Arab Socialist Union, when in order basically to do anything politically, you had to do it through that one official channel, or through channel, even it owned the press, it monopolized professional associations and so on. Even when there's a retreat from that, it's not as if the state has disappeared, but there are real variations in the degree to which the regime and the tools that the regime uses, and the degree to which it can manage that large state apparatus. So some of the there are various ways, for instance, to tell the story of 2011, and one of them certainly is of a popular uprising that was enough to bring down a ruler. The question that we were asking back at this Washington gathering was finally answered about what happens after Mubarak. But there's also a way in which the state apparatus was being reconfigured, and in a sense in which key state institutions felt a little bit of distance from the regime. We want the state to continue, but we're not quite sure we're wedded to this particular leader or that particular way of doing things. And then some of the post-2011 story, especially post-2013 story, can be seen as an attempt to kind of reassert and kind of rebuild a regime that has the ability to manage the state apparatus. So that's just a different way of looking at things. It's an attempt to kind of come up with an interpretive framework, as I say, that will speak to political scientists, the questions that interest political scientists about regime change, about state-society relations, interest group representation, and that sort of thing are ones that we try to address. But it's one in which we really try to keep a sharp empirical focus on the realities of Egyptian life. There's a very strong historical dimension in our story for that reason, in order to be alert to the particularities of the Egyptian case and to changes over time. So why don't I hand things over to Amr at this point. He disappeared for a moment. Internet connections in Egypt are never perfect, I think, but I will let him illuminate us, all of us, on the political economy side.
That's great. Before Amr starts, I just want to plant a bug in your ear, Nathan, for because you are talking about a state that, as you describe it, is lumbering. This evokes an image of a state that's a massive presence, but not necessarily a very effective presence. And if you think about Francis Fukuyama's distinction between the scope of state functions and state strength, when you're talking about Egypt, you're talking about an Egyptian state that does a lot of stuff and is involved in a lot of areas of life, but is not very strong at any of them, maybe except at repression, which is why Nazih Ayubi called it a fierce state, not a strong state. So I'm going to want to, when we have our more free-flowing conversation, I'm going to want to ask you, why is it that Egypt at this late date in human history has such a feckless state apparatus? Why was there a moment in Egyptian history where they could have actually developed a stronger state? But I just want you to start cogitating on that while Amr talks about the economic dimension of this story.
Thanks a lot for the very kind invite, as well as the very generous introduction. I hope that the book is as good as Professor Masoud introduced it. We definitely put some good effort in it. The idea was Nathan's, and I thought when we started working on it, some 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago, that it was a good idea. Nathan was looking for not so young Egyptian scholars, so that we can collaborate on a conceptual book. One that can rethink to a great extent the literature that exists in English on Egypt, as well as introduce at least a taste of the literature that has been produced by Egyptians and other Arabic-speaking writers on the topic. And hence we started that project that consumed almost 4 years of work. Of continual work that was quite collaborative. We had the chance to not write separate. It's not really an anthology. It's a one, I think, well integrated book where we all contributed jointly in the development, either writing together or providing feedback on whatever we were writing. So. In that sense, I really hope that the book might contribute to the debate on Egypt and to the debate on the region more generally, to the area studies on it. But I also would like to say that even though, of course, the book has one single case, we tried as hard as we could to draw comparisons beyond even the Middle East and North Africa. So we have these not very systematic way of comparing with other countries, but there is definitely allusion in an inter-regional rather than just an intra-regional comparison with other trajectories in the global South, in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in other parts of Africa than North Africa. So what we have been trying to do, more general, not only in the economy section, is not really to just like provide a textbook for, like on Egypt, but rather to rethink and to recategorize much of the literature, as I was saying, and to reconceptualize some of the phenomena that we thought were not adequately addressed in the literature or overlooked, etc. I find that the part that Nathan introduced is really like, for me it was like I learned a lot from that discussion on thinking state and regime in Egypt and the process of state formation, etc. I look forward, of course, to receiving like feedback from like those who had the chance to go through the book. The part on the economy, and it's really like political economy. I'm a political economist, I'm not an economist. And like what I try to develop with the help, of course, the feedback that I got from my colleagues and other like the other anonymous reviewers who were kind enough to provide feedback on the book manuscript, was to think of the process of market transformation or market making in Egypt from like a sociological perspective, more of like a bottom-up process. And that does not really mean that like I tried to, or we tried in the section to disqualify or to dismiss the rather mainstream focus that has been primarily on crony capitalism, on state capture by powerful interests, on the narrative that you have in Egypt's market making as of the time of Infitah, but mainly following the adoption in a more coherent and consistent manner of the structural adjustment program in the early 1990s, that opened the door for a very gradual and slow, yet quite consistent and until now irreversible process of privatization and liberalization, despite the significant reconfiguration that happened in political economic relations in the past 7 or 8 years, of course. But the focus has been mainly on the state, formally and informally, shaping the kind of market that emerged. Usually stifling the market by like favoring politically connected actors, either in the private sector or in the public sector, or like somewhere in the middle, where you have representatives of public bodies, for instance, that occupy favored positions that are monopolistic, or they create cartels, or like the different variations of rent seeking that is by definition undermining of competition, of efficiency, etc. That is not incorrect at all, in the sense of like this literature has extensively contributed to capturing these phenomena, analyzing them, and in holding that like responsible one way or another for the not very satisfactory like final outcome of this market making process. But what we try to do in the section is also to explain what seem to be processes of private accumulation, at least on sectoral basis, where social actors could react to market opportunities that were made available by the rolling back of the role of the state, by deregulation, by even like the large flows of remittances that went hand in hand with that coincided with Egypt's transformation as of the 1970s, and that continues to shape a significant part of Egypt's political economy. Like remittances nowadays, which are basically private savings and like private income, like stand for almost like an amount of money that is 5 or 6 times the total revenue of the Suez Canal, for instance. And it's something that usually like is only mentioned en passant, like you don't have much focus on it. But overall, we do have cases where economic actors were relatively autonomous. They could use not necessarily use, but the thing is that it's not that instrumental, but they those who occupied a certain habitus and had access to certain forms of social, cultural, and like other forms of financial and economic capital, could seize opportunities, could create market niches and occupy them. I think one of the most staggering examples, and this is only one example, which I think is literally the tip on the iceberg, is the very expansive economic activity that many businessmen and enterprises, business families, etc., that were affiliated with the Islamist movement turned out to have accumulated since the 1980s. And even though most probably this had to do with the regime under Mubarak, like ambivalence as part of its political strategy to allow the Islamists informally and to trim their influence every now and then, yet it indicates that we have these private accumulation mechanisms that most probably had to do with a certain habitus, in the sense of certain norms that were supportive of like seizing like market openings, private entrepreneurship, especially in areas of trade, of services. Some of them were related to religion, some of them were not, etc. But that's one thing where the state doesn't seem to occupy a very proactive role. It's rather the passive action of the state by not being systematically predatory or expropriating or confiscating these private assets until like the game changer happened less than 10 years ago. And that like was fortunate in a sense of revealing how much we have actors that have been relatively autonomous of the state, as I was saying. But I think that this applies like anecdotally on many occasions to different groups. And that's why we have a story to tell from the bottom up, where many actors as well as processes also were part of the process of market like transformation, the creation of market actors. In that sense, the ones that were socially embedded rather than just being politically embedded, like having access to like state rent or to like certain favorable or favored positions. So as I was saying, the book in general, my section, of course, in particular, which is not again my section, but the section that I primarily developed, because like there is considerable input from the two other authors, by the way, in the form of continuous rounds of feedback. But the section on the economy is not one that brings empirics in. It's not based on like extensive fieldwork or whatever. But I think again that the book is not really an introduction to politics and economics of Egypt as well as its society. It's rather like an invitation to reconceptualize much of the assumptions as well as the findings and conclusions that have come to be taken for granted. So it's about rethinking the scholarship on Egypt. And as Tarek was saying at the beginning, Egypt, of course, and like I'm trying not to be Egyptocentric. I know that other Arab countries are not necessarily like Egypt. I do know this. But the point is that like definitely it can help in the scholarship on the Arab world, on the Middle East and North Africa, as well as on like Africa and the contribution to the debate on the global South more generally, where we have things like parallels that we can draw, etc. So it's again about the angle and about the recategorization of some of the literature, the way we engage with it, and like an alternative way of telling the story. So it's like an attempt at creating a different narrative, one that is partly informed by like a re-evaluation of what we have there, about like some of the common or the conventional wisdom on Egypt, etc. Especially following the very tumultuous years of 2011 that revealed some of the points of strength in some instances, but also the shortcomings in others, as well as by trying to engage with the rather like not very systematically produced literature on Egypt that is in Arabic, but nevertheless one that was like important to engage with somehow and to try to mainstream. And that's why we have plans for now to like at least provide a version of the book, not a full translation of it, but a version like of it, so that it might be addressing Egyptians, especially that is talking about Egypt.
Yeah.
So I'll stop here.
Okay.
So that we have time for the Q&A.
This is great. Amr, this is fascinating. I think I probably myself did a poor job because I should have probably teed up your comments a little bit more. But so correct me if I'm wrong in characterizing the puzzle that you're engaging with thusly. That, Egypt, for those of you who are not as obsessed with the country as I am, you should know that starting in the 1950s, it really went on a path of kind of command economics, this what we would call Arab socialist agenda. So think sort of state-led state intervention in the economy, nationalization, particularly after the 1960s. And then starting in the 1970s, so this is under the Gamal Abdel Nasser, the kind of great exponent of Arab socialism and Arab nationalism. And I don't know if Nathan and Amr would agree with me, but one of the worst performing Arab leaders or leaders ever. I mean, I think I told my students the other day, I think Nasser failed on every single thing he tried to do and failed spectacularly. But after Abdel Nasser, of course, his successor, Anwar Sadat, reverses course on a lot of things. And one of those things was the economy. And he engages in this policy that Amr referred to as infitah, or opening, where he tried to liberalize. And in fact, by today, we have had more liberalization in Egypt than we have had the period of liberalization dwarfs the Nasserist period. And yet, liberalization has not led to the takeoff of the Egyptian economy. And so this is the puzzle that I think you're trying to explain. Why is it that this long period of liberalization, which has been real, maybe it's been halting, but it's definitely been real, how come the Egyptian economy today, I think what's the per capita GDP of Egypt? It's around 4,000, 5,000. Why has the Egyptian economy performed so poorly? And so I think that's what you're trying to explain. But I think, it would be great if our audience and our students, left here being able to hum a tune about what your answer is. Like, what has been the obstacle to this country in terms of achieving takeoff. So far we've asked two questions. The first of Nathan, which is, why does Egypt have such a weak, feckless state that tries to do a lot of things and does all of them badly except cracking people over the skull? And then a sub-question of that is, particularly in the realm of the economy, why has management of the economy or been so poor? Why has the Egyptian economy not been able to take off? And then I know that political scientists, especially today, I feel like the question, at least in our corner of the discipline, the Middle East studies discipline, we no longer like to ask about democratization, right? Like, even the section of the American Political Science Association that used to be called the comparative democratization section is now called the democracy and autocracy section, as if these two forms of government are equally worthy of our attention and allegiance. Whereas, I think it's perfectly fine for us to have a normative commitment to democracy and to ask why some countries are unable to achieve it. And I want to ask, in the Egyptian case, why is it that Egypt, particularly after 2011, has been really unable to cement the democracy that its people called for during the Arab Spring? And is there a path towards democracy that you see? So anyways, let me start with those, and then we'll see how much time we have. But hopefully, those are tractable questions. Nathan, do you want to start?
Yeah, let me start. Okay, so why isn't the Egyptian state strong, effective, and democratic? And let me I'll say a little bit about the strong part and a little bit of the democratic part, because we do try to address the democratic question in the book. The strength a little bit less so. We do use the phrase sometimes, strong states, but it's a concept that's slippery, because political scientists will kind of slip in what they mean. I mean, they can mean effective, which is one of the ways that you use it. They may mean strong in the sense of autonomous, able to make decisions. Was it 5 years ago? They just come in with a devaluation of the Egyptian pound and blam, a really momentous economic decision, and they just decide this is necessary. They do it. Why? What? And they couldn't have done it before. Did something similarly less drastic last week. I mean, so what explains states that can do that? That's kind of strength. And sometimes strength is just like, size and how big it is. It's big and present, share of GDP or a regulatory capacity or that sort of thing. So it's a step back a little bit from strength. And let me just talk about, I think there are two periods in which I thought the Egyptian state could have been reconfigured more fundamentally than it was. One is a period that you just talked about, sort of the end of the Nasserist period. And this is me talking. This is based on the book, so you may get a completely different answer from Amr. And you certainly had some fairly clear problems that were emerging, whether Nasserism was a total failure, a tragedy, it was good in its time, but just had run its course, whatever. There were clearly some issues that needed to be addressed. And when I look back at that period, I say they were addressed with a series of tactical decisions. So that's what was going on in the economy. We sort of narrate that. That's what's going on in society organization. Dismantling of the Arab Socialist Union is kind of done in different stages. That's kind of what's done politically. The political question, the political side of the question you just asked, Amr, why is there half a century of liberalization, no liberal economy? Why is there not half a century, but several decades of political liberalization and not a liberal political system? So there's something tactical going on in that period, which doesn't mean there's not real change, but it's not necessarily redesigning of the state apparatus. And the time that disappointed me, I mean, and I'm not alone in my sense of disappointment, is after 2011. And of course, there was sort of the big political story, and I don't need to narrate that. That may be familiar to many in the audience. There was something else that was interesting that was going on in Egyptian society that I'm not sure is over yet, but is certainly on pause. And that is what I refer to at the time as a series of mini revolutions, right? In places of work, in universities, and so there was a sense in which in an awful lot of institutions there was pressure from below, essentially, to make management more accountable, and so on. And that, I think, was a real engine of change in 2011, 2012, 2013. It was obviously going on at the time, and there's this big political struggle, over governance and Islamists and non-Islamists and military and security and so on. But it didn't have to come to an end, but it did. I think it did come to an end after 2013. Whether it's just sleeping or not, I don't know. But that's something that I look at. There's still a tremendous, I think, a vitality in Egyptian society that expresses itself in all kinds of realms, cultural expression and so on, and just has gone to sleep politically. And the question is, can it reemerge? In terms of the democracy story, again, that's a post-2011 story. I mean, you could ask that question for different periods as well, but that's when it's most pressing because, as you mentioned, Egypt did have a competitive presidential election, and somebody won with 51% of the vote. I mean, that's the closest election in Egyptian history, and from a democratic perspective, I don't think you could describe Egypt as democratic today. What we focus on a lot, because this is a period really I talked about the vitality of Egyptian society. This was when it was most obvious in every single realm, including social organizations, demonstrations, political party organization, and so forth and so on. And what we focus on, we're not the only people who have focused on this period, but is essentially, I think, the degree to which these various actors were, in a sense, I'm not going to say able to come to a consensus, because democracy is not about producing a consensus. Yeah. But it is about producing a specific path forward. These groups were simply unused to dealing with each other and didn't know how to deal with each other. And in effect, this may have been this is me kind of riffing off of the book, not recapitulating it, but I think this would be the thrust of the argument in the book. That's a legacy of repression that people are looking at, and that's what I think is going on here. So you have a period in which there is an inability of those groups to really kind of come together and to forge any kind of common understanding. And when, quote Hobbes, when all suits are played, clubs come up trump. And so I would really focus on that period as really a time of, in a sense, incredible democratization of Egyptian society when you look at democracy in kind of the cultural sense, how people express themselves, how people talk, how people make arguments, and so on. But obviously from a regime type perspective, very much a period in which there was a democratic experiment that lasted only a year or two.
Yeah. No, this is really great, Nathan. I mean, two things. On the state strength issue, I mean, certainly, there's, when we talk about, this is why I think Fukuyama's intervention is useful, because it disaggregates these things that you say people tend to aggregate. And, for me, the question really is about effectiveness. It doesn't matter what the Egyptian state tries to do, aside from cracking people over the skull, it does it very badly. And, this isn't inevitable. I mean, we see other states, including in the region, that actually have much more capacity, that are much more effective, using, whatever measure you want to use, World Bank Government Effectiveness Indicator. Like, there's variation in effectiveness. What is it about Egypt that renders them unable to actually have an effective state? And is that changing now under Sisi? So that's kind of where that question came from. On the question of democracy, I'm really interested to see that you say that it's, some of it is about the personalities involved, that, due to a legacy of repression, and I assume that that's a shout out to Elizabeth Nugent's work, but we got to a stage in that country where these people, Islamists, non-Islamists, various actors in the society who are supposed to be negotiating the post-autocratic order, just don't trust each other. And so eventually some of them go running to the army, and then this breaks down. But lots of other countries in the region have had similar, or other countries in the world rather, have had similar periods of repression. After all, authoritarianism is democracy is almost always born out of authoritarianism. And yet, in Tunisia, for example, for at least 10 years, they were able to get over their differences. So I wonder, there are alternative hypotheses that people might throw at you. And they might say, for example, well, one of the reasons that Egypt couldn't really cement democracy is because you had this military. I'm thinking of the work of our colleague, Josh Stacker, that, just was never going to come to terms with the idea of sharing power, right? This is a military that in some way or another has been in power since, the 1952, and they weren't, the Arab Spring and the overthrow of Mubarak might have caused them to retreat for a little bit, but all they did was bide their time until they were ready again to pull out the clubs and bash people over the head. So what's your response to that argument, which says, look, there wasn't really any hopeful outcome here because you have this overweening military, and overweening militaries do what overweening militaries do, which is they maintain control. And especially since Egypt is an underdeveloped society, relatively poor, the society itself, even though you describe it as restless, is actually weak. It can't organize to resist the tender administrations of the bearers of clubs. And that's why you have authoritarianism. What do you say to that argument?
I would say yes, and so the yes part is all that analysis is absolutely accurate. And yet, if that were the case, it should have been very close, very clear in 2011. I mean, did we just let our emotions run away with us and so on? And no, I would give a shout out not only to Elizabeth Nugent, who does talk about this, but also to Mona El-Khabashi, who really talks an awful lot about contingency. Things could have turned out very differently. Yeah. As political scientists, this is, I think, a little bit of fault we have. What we want to do is we want to explain outcomes.
Yeah.
And we want to label, okay, is Egypt democratic? No. So therefore, how do we explain that? Well, history doesn't have outcomes. It just doesn't end. So there are different kinds of possibilities. Those possibilities, I think, even with a strong military, there are ways in which, for instance, this can be negotiated. Countries with strong militaries that are kind of like in these kind of situations, they actually, there is a toolkit for dealing with them. And it goes something like this. You set up a National Security Council and you put the generals in charge, and they kind of have some kind of veto that disintegrates over time. I mean, Turkey did that, Portugal did that, Chile did it.
Didn't Egypt do it? Egypt did it. Yeah. Well,
Egypt could have done it. I mean, that could have been, actually the SCAF, remember, was chaired by the president of the republic, right?
But then they also, in the Constitution, they established a National Security Council that was majority generals or, people of the hard state.
Yes. So they certainly did that. I mean, I think there are a variety of insurance devices in the current Egyptian constitution. That's just one of them. But essentially, that's what I think actually the Brotherhood in Power was trying to do, is to negotiate a deal. Okay, you can have control over this. Don't worry, we won't mess up the relationship with the United States. We're not going to send you into war against Israel. I'll talk tough about Syria, but don't worry. I think that was a deal it was trying to negotiate. I think it wasn't just a matter of I wouldn't say personalities. I mean, in a sense, I'm maybe contradicting myself here, but I think various actors behaved, if not completely rationally, at least reasonably. They understood their situation, I think, actually fairly well. The idea of some kind of grand civilian coalition to wall in the hard state or the deep state or the security services, there were reasons why that didn't look like an attractive option to the Brotherhood while it was in power. There were reasons why the non-Islamist opposition, didn't really trust the Brotherhood. But again, I'm looking at a few key decisions and a few key points. I'll just mention one: the dissolution of the parliament by the Supreme Constitutional Court. What that did, I think, was convey a specific message to various political actors in ways that really hardened their positions. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's not just a legacy of repression. It's also things that may have turned out differently, or then that actors may have calculated slightly differently, had the suit come up at a slightly different time, or that sort of thing. That I think you could have had different outcomes. So Egypt could have become Denmark. Well, things had gone differently in 2012.
Yeah, no, that's a really fascinating argument, and I'm reading Professor Ghobeshi's book right now, and it's great, and there clearly what political actors do matters, and there is contingency. I mean, there's contingency over all kinds of things. But I wonder, just to kind of, sharpen for everybody the debate that exists here. Okay, so there's one school that says things could have ended up better had actors made different decisions, and those decisions could have happened. And there's another school that says, look, the decisions of the actors are actually endogenous to deep structural factors. So, for example, people say the Islamists who captured, at least one elections in the immediate aftermath of the overthrow of Mubarak, they say, well, what the Islamists should have done? They really should have reached out in a much more sincere and aggressive way to their opponents and included them in some kind of grand coalition. And if they had done that, then we would have cemented democracy. But of course, Egypt is, for a lot of different reasons, the kind of place where when you run elections, the Islamists totally dominate. So imagine you totally dominate an election. And then somebody says to you, hey, those guys who just lost abysmally, why don't you make some concessions to them? Why would you? And in fact, if you think about it, if I'm the leader of a political party and I've got all these young bucks in my party who, oh my God, we've just won. And I say, yes, not only just won, but we're not actually going to capitalize on our victory. I might not be the leader of the party for very much longer. So then you have to ask yourself, why is it that Islamists dominate? And then you get into things like, well, Egypt is a poor society and people are very traditional. And so they vote. So then, it's these deeper factors that affect the outcome. It's possible to me that Egypt's president, Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood guy who's eventually overthrown by the military, it's possible to me that he could have danced and bobbed and weaved enough to prevent the military from overthrowing him. And so there would have been a different outcome on one dimension, which is that, like, instead of a military coup, we have no military coup. But would Egypt be a democracy, or would it be a one-party state? So in other words, the structural arguments which would lead us to predict that this poor, agrarian, underdeveloped country cannot sustain democracy was right. And then the question is just, contingency determines which kind of non-democracy are we going to get? Are we going to get a military dictatorship or a one-party dictatorship led by these sort of, soft theocrats? What am I getting wrong there?
I'll try and respond, but again, the book probably tilts a little bit more towards the kind of structural.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
So, and I'm not completely uncomfortable with that. It was a difficult hand. Yeah. But what I would say is, let me go back to the title of the APSA, American Political Science Association. It's democracy and autocracy, right? And what I think that misses is there's a lot of different regime types out there, and you might be able to sort them all in one camp or the other if you had to, but you don't have to, right? So what you're talking about is a variety of possible outcomes, yes, some of which might be more or less democratic. And I think there were possible different outcomes in, some kind of Islamist army condominium. That would have been difficult, but it wouldn't have been impossible, I don't think. Some kind of, I think one thing that would have really changed things had the rules been designed in a different way. Some of the rules were there just by accident, I think, to have allowed earlier elections. The Islamists would have behaved differently. They were very aware that they do badly in any upcoming elections. But if there had been some kind of device there, and there wasn't a device just because some of these things were deliberate, or specific actors saying we've got to write the Constitution this way, and some of it was just, the Constitution was passed in the middle of the night. We just got to get this done, and so I think there could have been different rules that may have produced different outcomes. I'm not going to say necessarily democracy, but would have produced different kinds of maybe imperfect outcomes, maybe some better, some worse, but something different than what we have right now.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you, and I think the dichotomous coding of regimes, would have those two alternative scenarios, both authoritarian, but you could make a very strong argument that one is preferable, in part because it contains within it more democratic potential down the road. I want to ask Amr a question that's a little different than the question I posed to you earlier, Amr, but then I want to let our audience ask you questions. So, in Egypt, as we know, in 2013, the democratic experiment was decisively abrogated by the military. And I remember at the time being very sad by this, and then consoling myself by saying, you know what, Egypt is, after all, it has a lumbering state, a terrible, I should find a better adjective than terrible, a crummy economy, Maybe what we need is a period in which we finally get one of the few benefits of authoritarianism, right? Egypt's gotten authoritarianism without any of the benefits, right? But if we get a kind of capable, competent authoritarianism that rams through the complete liberalization of the economy, and, Sisi becomes somebody like Pinochet, who is a terrible person, but who presided over a liberalization of the Chilean economy that some scholars would say actually set the stage for the later emergence of a strong civil society that was able to compel the military to withdraw. And I thought to myself, maybe this is what we need in Egypt. And we'll have this for 10, 15, 20 years, and then we'll wake up and we'll find, hey, we're a pretty, vibrant economy, and no longer can Egypt be ruled by command, and yada, 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 democracy. Okay. To state the formal logic of modernization theory. And why was that a stupid hope that I had? I mean, I clearly think it was stupid now, but was it a stupid hope, or is that still a hope that one should have?
Well, I'm not that hopeful really, but again, I don't think that the issue is merely with the kind of policies or strategies. This is one ingredient in like response to many of the I wouldn't say necessarily like structural, but they are structural, like long-standing challenges or restraints having to do with the regional context, having to do with Egypt's position in the division of labor, and development is not that easy. We know that it's not an easy task. But of course, one of the issues that are usually used in order to explain why we end up pretty much in the same situation every decade or so, the issue with the IMF having to be brought in order to pretty much do the same job every 10 years. This itself is, of course, the causality is not very clear. Is it because of the IMF, or is the IMF there because of the weaknesses that lead to the calling of the IMF to do the same job all the time? But the issue here is that it goes without saying that you don't really have an economic strategy. But many of the countries like Egypt, you don't wake up with an economic strategy. It's not a God-given thing. It's it requires certain institutions, certain institutional arrangements, not only within the state, but between the state and the basic, the main protagonists in the economy, etc., for upgrading, for an industrial strategy, etc. And it happens that many countries, Egypt included, cannot just get there. So there are certain many of the difficulties are not made at least on purpose by those who are in charge, but definitely not much is being done in order to address these in the long term. So I think that the regional and global contexts are there. They don't overdetermine the outcome. But they do eventually impact the kind of opportunities that are there. My analysis is that the kind of what seems to be a successful authoritarian stabilization that happened in the past 5 or more, almost 10 years now, has enabled the Egypt's reintegration into global financial markets, mainly through debt. So that nowadays you have macroeconomic choices that are primarily being addressed to creditors, especially private equity funds that have been financing in a very short-term manner the Egyptian foreign debt. Many of these weaknesses have been there. They are structural. They have been inherited from earlier times. Many of them were exacerbated by the turmoil that followed 2011 and the very, very badly managed, and quite dismal process eventually that led to the collapse of the whole trajectory at a very high cost. But the point is that we are left in the very same situation where you have very short-term concerns, mainly financial ones, that guide the longer-term considerations of investment policy, of how foreign investment is to be channeled into the economy. So eventually, you don't really have a coherent strategy at all. There are just like policies in order to keep things going. And of course, many of these policies are not just about the macro economy. Many of them are directly related to the preservation of like the kind of public order, because at the end of the day, this is an issue. It's not only the regime type, it's also the state, given the rampancy of state failure in the region. Like the context is really bad, so in that sense, it's the inability to get started, so that eventually you have this loop that does not make it possible to get beyond it. Part of this, again, like it's back to Machiavelli, like the fortuna e virtù. So you need some fortuna, but then you need virtù as well. Like without virtù, there isn't much. So even when things were sometimes, not now, but like even when things were a bit opportune for better decisions to be made, not much was done. I mean, like one of the things that I'm very much interested in, and that was dealt with differentially a bit in a rather heretical manner in the book, was the last 10 years under Mubarak. The ones that were associated with the succession, like what was called Mashru' Tawis for Mubarak Jr. And of course, like all of us were opposed to it. It's not the issue. But the point is that the economic program that was adopted at the time actually offered relatively better terms of integration than the ones that we are nowadays. Like, for instance, it was not through debt; it was more through foreign direct investment. It was it was promising in that sense, but of course, it also had to do with the global context pre-2008, the financial meltdown, which was offering other opportunities that we could have made use of. So it's a bit tricky in that sense. Tara, I think you are muted.
I want to open it up for questions, but in the interest of being intellectually honest, when you mentioned Mashru' Tawrith, which was the project, the alleged project that Mubarak had to pass power to his son, and you said we're all against it. I was actually, when I was a young assistant professor, I was on a panel with Nathan Brown, and we were talking about succession, and I was like, I'm going to make a big splash. And I said, actually, if Gamal Mubarak succeeded, that wouldn't be so bad, because the alternative is the military, and that's much worse. And lots of people hated me. I was persona non grata in a lot of places, but though my stupidity knows no bounds, I don't think that was the stupidest thing I ever said. Okay, let me open this up to our audience, and let me just remind everybody of how we will do this. If you have a question of Professor Brown or Professor Adly, use the Zoom raise hand function, and then I will call on you. And just also note that because we're recording this event, and this event will probably live online, if you do raise your hand, that means you are signaling your consent to be recorded and to have your question preserved for posterity. So while people are building up the courage to ask questions of these two learned scholars of Egypt, I guess I have a question for both of you, which is, about the current situation in Egypt. And I know that obviously, it's there's all kinds of political sensitivities that one needs to be aware of. But is there, both of you, I think, sounded a note of pessimism. But there's a lot of people that I talk to, and I know you both talk to, that would actually be quite optimistic about where Egypt is. And they would look at what the current government is doing, and they would say, the government is finally confronting some longstanding problems. It's making some serious investments in infrastructure. It's not shy about doing things like devaluing the Egyptian pound, which needed to happen, ages ago, and just happened again. But Mubarak was always very skittish about doing things like that. So, what I guess I'm going to ask you to inhabit for a moment the body of the most optimistic cheerleader of the present government of Egypt, and tell us, what is the most defensible, optimistic argument you can make about Egypt right now, and about it, particularly with respect to its management of the economy? Or what do the optimists say?
What do the optimists say? Well, they have been successful at stabilizing the economy, not just the country. The economy, inflation was brought down, growth was relaunched, and Egypt is one of the very rare cases, by the way, in the past couple of years worldwide, not only in the region, that has been growing with positive rates. Compared to most of the other economies. So that puts us with a few countries in East Asia, even though, of course, that happened at the risk of the pandemic going out of control. But nobody knows whether it went out of control or not. That's the nice thing of having it both ways. So the idea is that the economy did grow. The economy, Egypt's economy, remains diversified internally. But the key issue again is how we relate to the rest of the world. Much of the growth has been and that's doing even more of what we already had, is that you have this growth through non-tradable sectors, especially real estate, construction, infrastructure, etc., that don't simply address the Achilles heel, which is either replacing imports or increasing exports. That's the key issue. So we are there still. The problem is getting bigger. It's not getting smaller, and that's why. I don't know, to be optimistic. I don't know how to be optimistic, but the point is that there is room for some diversification. It just requires not only different policies, but different institutional arrangements. And here comes the problem of the chicken and the egg, how to start and are institutions created, or do they evolve as the first part of the book raises questions, which would make it quite necessarily pessimistic, because then we know which right institutions should be there, but we have no idea how to cultivate them or how to establish them. And that's an open-ended question. That was raised, I think, since Tocqueville was studying the early American democracy and comparing it to France. And he had this can we do anything? So we're just diagnosing the problem, and then we have no idea whether it's reversible or curable or whatever. So in that sense, I think it is hard to be optimistic, especially at this moment, because we have many of the structural vulnerabilities that have reappeared with vengeance, especially with the exposure to hot money, with in the event of higher interest rates on the dollar, and then the Ukraine crisis, which showed many of the weaknesses across the region. So, overall, no, it's very hard to be is there potential? Yes, there is potential, but this potential remains very theoretical. It remains just on paper.
Yeah.
But how this can be effective is the bigger issue.
Yeah.
And that's why, by the way, one of the interesting things would be to look differently at how the economy has evolved, how economic relations have evolved a bit away from the state. Because one of the paradoxes that we have here is that we have an overstatement of the ability of the state to shape the economic sphere, even if negatively, which goes against the fact that we have, for instance, rampant informality, and inability to regulate much of the economic activities, very limited extractive capacity. And that itself is a contradiction in the literature that exists on state-economy relations in many parts of the global South, Egypt included, that most probably will tell us that there are certain gaps where we have socially embedded market actors that might present the right points to start from.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, Dr. Amr, but again, it requires a
Well,
system.
I'm calling you Tariq, so it's like at least you call me Amr.
Sorry, okay. I think, what that would require is a system that um, is not necessarily inclusive, but at least that isn't suspicious of any kind of independent activity. One of the things that I find so heartbreaking about Egypt is Egypt has lots of brilliant, creative people, and yet the people who make decisions, the people who manage the state are not those most brilliant, creative people. And in a way, I find Egypt to be unlike, for example, some of its patrons, Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. If you're a smart Saudi or a smart Emirati, they will bring you into decision making, because they want to get the best ideas and their best young people helping to make their country as prosperous and powerful and influential and innovative as possible. And we, on the other hand, Egypt, on the other hand, you find that the most interesting and innovative and capable people really find no place within the governing apparatus. They're under some suspicion. Maybe here and there you might point to one or two personages, but mostly, it's the military and the people that the military trusts. And that to me is a tragedy. And I wonder, what needs to happen for, Egypt's leaders to understand that for them to finally deliver on their country's promise, to finally fulfill the aspirations that Egyptians have had forever, they're going to need to actually tap their own talent. I don't know what needs to happen. Yeah, please, Nathan.
Can I come in here just very briefly? I mean, I agree completely with all of that analysis. And when I get most depressed about Egypt is when I see how the system treats young talent. Absolutely. But you want cause for hope or optimism. Let me just give you two, and I think they're very small, but they're not, they could grow. There are two areas where Egyptian politics I saw kind of come back alive, not fully, but personal status law. The government is trying to come out with a new family law, and it can't. And the reason is everybody's got a different version. And so suddenly there's vetoes distributed across the Egyptian society on this, Al-Azhar and National Council for Women and so on. And they can't make a decision. So they can about devaluation, but they can't about family law. And in this sense, that's hopeful. There's politics. And the second is you looked at their response about COVID. And one thing that was really interesting was how much various ministers and the cabinet as a body came forward. So suddenly this was not, I mean, the first day, yes, the military's out there spraying the streets. And then they realized, no, wait a second, this is complicated. It's a public health issue. It's this, it's that, it's an economic issue. What you get from that is something to me that does not look again like Denmark. It looks like Franco's Spain, late Franco's Spain, technocratic, rigid, authoritarian, culturally very conservative, but at least kind of sometimes pockets of it run by competent people. I don't think that's where Egypt is, but I think there's some signs. If you want signs for hope, that's where it's moving.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, we're actually at the end of our time, but I do think, Nathan, you really point to something very important there that even I had not fully allowed myself to grasp or put into words. But you do see, for example, just to riff on this point that you've made, in a lot of different areas, the government, for example, seems to be very responsive to activity on social media. So if you look at, for example, the sexual harassment laws that were recently passed in Egypt, that in part is being responsive to some agitation on social media. So I think that is a pocket of optimism. It suggests that there's some mobilizational potential, or at least potential by which people can force government to be a little bit more responsive to them. So I started this talk by saying Egypt is the most important country in the world. I still stand by it, but we did not do it justice because we only talked for 75 minutes. And so what I'm going to ask both of our guests for is their indulgence and to come again and visit us here so that we can continue this conversation about this important country in person. But again, Nathan and Amr, thank you so much for writing this book. I think generations of scholars of Egypt are going to start here. It's really instructive about this wonderful, beautiful, heartbreaking, maddening country called the Arab Republic of Egypt. So thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for having us.
And I want to thank my students and members of our audience for coming. I should tell you all that our next event will be at the same time, 1:30 on Thursday, April 7th. And then we will talk about another very important country, in fact, Egypt's neighbor to the south, Sudan, with Dr. May Hassan of the University of Michigan, and she will talk about Sudan's road to democracy. So please join us then. Until then, once again, thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Amr. And thank you all.